Hello friends, in the series that is running these days regarding English writing in India, we have today a poetic voice from Manipur, and this voice offers a distinct kind of image of the world that the tribal poets there, tribal communities generally have created. And the poetry is supposed to be very, very symbolic, emphasizing, a kind of freshness, a kind of energy that might be missing somewhat in the contemporary literature of other states and regions. And I'm quite curious to know from Professor Bajaj, who teaches English in Hindu College, Delhi University, what kind of poetry would that be where humans behave as humans, they talk as humans, and the social influences for a long while do not come into the picture directly. So I have that kind of an image. Maybe I'm wrong, and I stand corrected by whatever she might say. One thing is quite clear, that the question of politics, the question of poetic expression are intermingled in most of the poets that I've read from the Northeast. And I don't know whether this poet is going to be an exception or just to follow the same principle. So let me now invite Professor Bajaj to start a lecture, please.
Thank you, Professor Prakash. Yes, we will be discussing a voice from Manipur, and the poet I'll be discussing today is Thangjam Ibopishak. I've also called him kind of a poet of protest poet, and writing a kind of poetry of protest. And you rightly said that the poems here are very symbolic, in fact almost surrealistic. And his poems make use of the absurd. And you mentioned that they are human and you're not yet not human. So I think you've very interestingly made the framework for this kind of Manipuri poetry, because you find him talking about humans and not humans. For instance, one of his poems is titled "The Land of Half Humans." So I think that it's interesting that you were able to see that kind of larger framework and then place these poets within it. Now, before we actually try and understand Ibopishak's works, it's very important to first understand Manipur as a place, and also the Northeast, in the sense that the Northeast has obviously felt marginalized in the larger scheme of things in India, and there have been a lot of these movements, secessionist movements, insurgencies that you see in the entire region, and which is why in this, if you are aware of it, then you would know that there was something called AFSPA, which is the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, which was put in place in 1958, particularly in disturbed areas, in order to combat this kind of insurgency, because there were a lot of these demands and there were secessionist movements that wanted to break away from India. So this act was put in place in 1958 to control this kind of rebellion and to control the insurgency of the time. In Manipur specifically, it came in 1980. Now, while it served its purpose, the act itself, it caused a lot of hue and cry in the very region itself. For instance, you find that, and the problems that came along with it were that there was some sort of peace and order was maintained, but then at what cost? So, the AFSPA, or the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, granted special powers to the army, and officers then could use fire or any kind of, they could shoot at sight anybody, they could use any kind of force, even causing death, against people who were acting against the law and disrupting order in the disturbed areas. Now, the army officers, of course, had legal immunity, and for their actions. This led to some very serious human rights violations in the region, and the writers of the time could not come to terms with how to project this reality. The kind of violence that escalated in the region, you found that on one hand there were these rebellious groups and insurgents, etc., who required money, and on the other hand there was a very strong foothold of army officers all over the region. So there is no normalcy. When we think of a normal life, there is no normalcy in this region, which is totally completely affected by one or the other side. So what about the common people, the ordinary people who want a simple life for themselves
and they want normalcy?
And they want normalcy, like they are not a part of insurgency, they are not a part, but you know, they are always looked at suspicion by both the insurgents and state agencies. Like the police would look at them suspiciously, the insurgents would look at them with suspicion, and you know, they're walking on a very tight rope in that sense, because these are people who don't want to be a part of any kind of.
Does literature help others, you know, to walk, you know, along the question of harmony, question of togetherness, etc.?
Right, it does. You see, that is what I'm trying to explain, that in the region there was a period when there was this kind of, particularly speaking specifically of Manipur, Manipuri poetry, for instance, in the 1940s and 50s, that kind of age was still had very realistic socialist kind of poetry written, and it had that kind of you know, outlook. But you know, soon enough, when you reach the stage of the 1970s or so, and particularly when the region is becoming very is being disrupted by violent activities, 1970s, etc., and 1980s after AFSPA, you find that the region has become very volatile, and the writers are unable to grapple with this reality, and you know, they enter this area of complete rejection. They go into the disgust, they go into scatology, they you know, they go into you know, it's like the critics of that period, you know, say that these are angry young, you know, writers who are just vomiting on the page. You know, that's the kind of criticism that came for writers during this period, that they are so sick of the reality, yes, but then they are using literature as a form of,
there are
most of them, yes, young poets who are coming to the fore. And Ibopishak began writing around the same time, 1960s. In fact, he took to writing seriously around 1964 or so. He started writing poetry when he was a young boy, you know, still in school, and but seriously pursuing this art, he began in 1964. So from 1964 to 1967 is the period when you find that Ibopishak is writing still romantic kind of poetry, you know, about nature. Now, of course, the contradiction of this land, particularly the entire Northeast, is that the place is so beautiful that it automatically evokes this kind of image of beauty. And then poetry naturally finds its place there through songs, music, you know, because they are so close to nature, and natural beauty impresses on them in such a way that it is unmissable. And yet, gun, bloodshed, violence, gore, these are the kind of other things that, you know, that starkly are present alongside the beautiful.
What comes to my mind is that Tagore was greatly inspired by the Manipuri culture, the sense of rhythms. And in fact, when he discussed dances, he was himself a good dancer, and he started saying that perhaps dance-wise, Manipuri culture is the richest. That's what Tagore says.
Yes. No, certainly, because of their culture, and it draws a lot of strength from the natural beauty that they see, with the forms, the seasons, the blossoms, you know, the changing of the seasons. So even Ibopishak wrote poetry of nature, of rain, you know, and, you know, of all these, you know, the rains falling, and so there is a kind of a romantic sort of bent in his poetry in the period from 1964 to 67. But post 1967, he moves away from writing poetry of nature or natural imagery. In fact, he moves away from it, so much so that, you know, he would just completely distort, in fact, the natural imagery also. So there is a sense of, he moves towards talking about human existence in general. A kind of universalism is also there, and a kind of harmony. But then steadily he actually moves in a very dark, macabre sort of genre of poetry, right? And this has to do with, I think, a lot to do with the period of the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s in Manipur. Now, a lot of you who might have known or have heard of somebody called Iram Sharmila would know that she's called the Iron Lady of Manipur. She began her hunger strike in 2000, the year 2000, seeking and calling for the abolition of AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. She ended her intermittent fast in 2016. So for 16 years, that woman went on an intermittent fast, and she was force fed in custody, just because they wanted her to break her fast. So I'm just saying that, this is a kind of a long fight that people are waging against this kind of heavy deployment of army and heavy deployment of, armed gunned men in the area, because it is taking away their lives away from them. And very importantly, something happened in 2004, and maybe you should just go back and look up. It was called the Protest of the Mothers of Manipur, or Manipuri Mothers. There were these 12 elderly women who actually stripped themselves naked in front of the Assam Rifles headquarters at Kangla Fort, and to protest against the rape and murder of this young girl Manorama. And Manorama was, she was shot in her genitals over 10 times, and on the charges that she was probably a traitor or an insurgent. And all these mothers were so filled with anger that they stripped themselves naked and they went out on the streets. They just held this banner which said, "Indian Army rape us," and it said, "Take our flesh." And they were all demanding for the repeal of AFSPA in the region. Now remember that AFSPA is still active in Manipur, and Manipur is still in a very, very turbulent times, and it's facing its own problems. But what I'm trying to explain through this is that Ibopishak has this as his background. What kind of poetry do we expect from such a poet? It is Northeast India, which is completely experiencing corruption, conflict, violence. So the poets of this region took to writing protest poetry, or what they call poetry in the time of terror.
Incidentally, Richa, in the 1980s and 90s, when I was teaching in Delhi University, there was a large number of students who came from Manipur, most of them women, and they were very aesthetically, inclined in all senses. They wrote poetry themselves. They talked about nature, and they were very, very sweet to talk to. So I have, my image is that it's a very calm, tranquility loving community, and wants to live in natural ways, and that is so very close to poetic living to that extent.
Yes, their sense of music, dance, art, folklore, it's very strong.
Yes.
And you're very right, they're very sensitive people in that sense of writing poetry. They see it as art, because they are also tribal communities. They have their own folk forms, and they are less in that sense
and there
traditional.
was a very fine sense of humor. One of the students who was a poet. So she said, I couldn't pronounce her name, and she said, "Well, you can't pronounce my name, but call me chewing gum."
Right. You see, that's true. Their humor is not. It's kind of wry humor. It's almost, it verges on satire, because they already understand that you're beyond their. You cannot understand them, and you're very right in the sense, because Ibopishak would do exactly that. He's like, we live in a place where we have headless bodies and bodiless heads, so suggesting that your bias or our prejudice begins with just spelling their names or pronouncing their names wrong, and I do that all the time with my students actually. I always keep telling them to correct me wherever the pronunciation is wrong.
You have students from
Yes, I have a lot of students from Northeast, and it inevitably is so, and you are put to shame because you're supposed to know their names properly. So the idea is that they already have given up on us. In the sense, the people from central India or whatever, they've already given up on us, because they know that you cannot understand us.
But everybody writes poetry there.
Yeah.
This is what I saw.
That's true.
Do they share poetry with you?
Yeah, they do. In fact, I have some published poets, who've presented books that, from Northeast, that we've written this kind of work. So they veer towards poetry very easily, because they're close to that kind of world. Now, poets from the Northeast, therefore, can be seen as writing a poetry of survival. It is a matter of survival that they must actually enter this area. And very rightly put by Gangom once, that they have guns pressed to both their temples. This is what their life is. They have guns pressed to both their temples, the gun of the revolution and the gun of the state. So an ordinary person doesn't know which way to go, because clearly you're just trying to live your life in a normal sense, but either there is the revolution or the state that is already always putting the gun on your temples. So I think that's the kind of reality that one needs to understand, is what Thangjam Ibopishak is trying to convey through his poetic practice.
Any example of glowing symbols there?
Glowing symbols?
Yes, symbols that haunt you.
Yes, there are lots. Let me just come to the poetry of Ibopishak. You will see what it is like.
You can give an example straight away.
I can, of course, give an example straight away. Let me give you an example. This is this poem which is titled Dali Hussain, Salvador Dali, Dali Hussain, or Odor of Dream, Color of Wind, 2003. Now, if you think of it, he's evoked two very important names, Salvador Dali and M.F. Hussain. And he says Dali Hussain or.
He combines the two.
Yeah, or. You can think of Dali or Hussain for this poem as the title, or you can think the poem of the title to be Odor of Dream, Color of Wind.
Remarkable.
Do dreams have odor? Wind has color?
In poetry they can.
Yes, but does wind have color? Do you associate a color with wind? You don't. What he's trying to say here, he's going to talk about a poem which will talk about the invisible reality. The color of wind is invisible, but is it there? If you think it is there, it is there. And if you don't, then it is not. And yet it is there. The wind is there. Do dreams have odor? He says not. And yet they do. So
are colors in imagination or up there in the clouds or whatever?
No, but colors are there. He's saying color of wind.
Yes.
Yeah, he's not talking about the color of the sky or other things. He's talking about the wind. So talking about Salvador Dali itself, if you look at the image on the screen, you'll see this. I've put two pictures of Salvador Dali. One of them is the woman who has a bouquet of flowers in place of the head. It's the headless woman with the bouquet of roses. And then there is the persistence of memory, which is where the clock is flowing and you see melting time, right? There is a clock that is melting. Everything is melted, right? So there is the persistence of memory. Now there is the kind of persistence of time or persistence of things which I don't know what he means here, but those are the kind of works that Salvador Dali came up with. Hussain we associate with the Cubist style of paintings. He would paint these abstract expressionisms. So what is abstract expressionism? It is a rejection. Both these artists, in fact, rejected the realistic projections, or in fact gave distorted images of reality. Right. Now this Cubist, of course, taking after say Picasso. Now think of this as title and keeping that as the background, he writes his poem. Now let me read the first stanza of the poem. It says, "My uncle from Wangu asked me, how many bushels of paddy have you stored for this season? I asked my friend Kesho again, how many kgs of poems have you written for this month? Write and then tear up, write and then tear up. A cashier counts old 1 rupee notes, a rotten mouldy bundle of notes. 1,700, only 11. Spending 1 hour, 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Then after the final counting, washing his hands clean with Dettol, he eats up the notes one by one."
Remarkable. The range, the expanse of the poem, and so many, indirect references to the topsy-turvy world in which one lives. All that has been captured so well.
Yes. And this is what I mean. This is an example of his kind of turning things on its head or distorting reality. Now, so what I mean is that it just goes on and on. If you think of, the poem, it has so many layers of meaning. Now, to begin with, if you were to just talk about it, he says, my uncle asked, you're quantifying everything. The whole idea of his disgust with this kind of materialism, or you could say the rising sense of corruption and capitalism in the region, where he says that everything is quantified. Just as you would count bushels of paddy, you are counting poetry. How many kgs of poems have you written for this month? So as suggesting that art is not something that can be quantified, or art is not something that can be counted. Art is a different sphere. Art is not, and taking it away from, in a way, reality. Now, a lot of times people have also said that, maybe Ibopishak believed in arts for art's sake, because in one of his interview, which was in 1997, Ibopishak had said that, to me, poetry is nothing but art, and that, in a way, he says that, in a way, he was suggesting that you cannot ask poetry to be a propaganda or a slogan. He continued, he said, I quote, poetry cannot be treated as a weapon against the system of society. It cannot change the prevailing ethos. Then he goes on to say, the influence of poetry does not lie outside, but in its silence, unquote.
And why silence?
Yes, very important.
Because you don't have much to appreciate, therefore you remain silent.
No, but that's not the only thing. What he really also means to suggest, at least that's what I read into it, is that the poetry does not work through propaganda. Poetry works from the inside. He says it does not lie outside. You can't see it in banners. You will not find it. Poetry is not supposed to be something that is visibly seen to create or effect change. But poetry works on the inside, works in silence on the person. It enters the mind and then creates that kind of moment of change. I think what he's saying is you cannot ask poetry to be the weapon of social change, take banners or go for protests or join processions, etc. Poetry, he says, does not do that. Poetry, he says, works on people in silence. It has its effect on people when it is read in silence. How would you, it's also something to say about poetry as art, and the role of poem.
It's a very serious idea, and in the 19th century, these aesthetes, Oscar Wilde and all, they appeared on the scene, and they started saying art for art's sake.
Right.
Because life is very different from art.
And life is crude.
It's crude.
Right.
It's not subtle at all. It's also insensitive. So that insensitive is to be countered. Counter it with the example of fineness or subtlety in art, which is not there in life. Perhaps that's what the meaning of the aesthetic movement in the 19th century.
Right. Yeah, because it set me thinking the moment I read the last line. Initially, it looked to me that he was saying that poetry can't be seen as a weapon against the system of society, clearly. But he says that poetry works in silence. Its influence happens in silence. Its influence does not happen in material reality on the outside, but it starts fermenting in a person only in silence, actually, in introspection, in reflection.
In drama, for instance, in a dramatic situation, you are asking something from a person and the person keeps quiet. So if you ask again, the person again, so that silence, becomes a kind of comment on your thinking.
And maybe silence becomes the weapon.
Silence becomes the weapon, yes.
Yes. So I think that is something that you always find. So this is a very different kind of writing that you see in Ibopishak, and the poem itself, as I mentioned, talks about this kind of rotten reality. Now imagine the section that I read. He first about quantifying a poem with bushels and paddy, suggesting that a poem has its own life. A poem is not to be understood. You can't say how many books have you published, and therefore you are a poet if you've published 10 books. So the quantifying of it is also reducing it to its material worth, which he says poetry is not all about. Poetry is about writing and then tearing up, and writing and then editing and tearing up. And then he goes on to talk about a similar, he puts these different, he follows Salvador Dali's style. Now Salvador Dali always put these objects together, which were disconnected, and yet they were to be, you had to make the connection with them, right? If you look at this picture also, then you will see these different objects on the screen, but they may make sense and yet not make sense, right? You can connect one with the other, but then once you connect the disconnected things, a narrative emerges, right? So here also, when he says my uncle from Wangu asked me, right? And then he says, I asked my friend Kesho, how many poems have you written? And then he brings up another image of the cashier. Now, a cashier counts old 1 rupee notes, rotten, moldy bundle of notes. Who's a cashier? A cashier will never have hold of this money that the cashier is counting. These are 1,700, only 11. This money, this cashier can't take home. And he's just counting notes, that kind of mechanical job that he's talking about, a kind of headless activity, and he's only seeing how much have I counted, and feeling proud that I've counted 1,700 notes in 1 hour, 2 minutes, 15 seconds, suggesting as if that's some kind of reward. So just this kind of mechanical counting. And then he says after counting, he washes his hands clean with Dettol and then he eats up the notes one by one. This is a very clear example of corruption. Like we'd say, koi paisa khata hai. That's what you'd say, right? So eating up notes literally would mean somebody is eating up money.
Eating up money.
Right? And one by one.
And if they are soiled notes.
Yeah. So what is he doing? Look at the kind of such satire. Do you see this kind of biting sort of satire here when he says he washes his hands with Dettol and then eats up the moldy notes, the rotten notes, the soiled notes,
once again.
the smelly notes. So he says he eats up so you are washing your hands but you're eating up. So, the image of somebody, you want to be a clean person, the clean sort of within quotes, people who have a very clean sort of image, right? But what are they doing? They're eating up these moldy, soiled notes, they are eating up money. Their actual work is so filthy, they can wash their hands and go do sacred activities. They can wash their hands with Dettol and appear clean and, in white clothes, etc. But actually, the work is filth-ridden and corrupt. So I think the kind of play that he's doing with these images says more than what he means.
So friends, in the first part of the discussion, Dr. Bajaj has talked about kind of poetry that may be a comment on us, that also may be very revealing in the sense, that poetry within itself is a beautiful function, is a beautiful kind of awareness, and that should be shared by the poet with the readers also. So this kind of an idea, general idea, plus disturbed situations in Northeast, and somehow poets are trying to make sense of it. All this makes the entire discussion very fascinating. So in the second part, we will have more examples of this poet that Dr. Bajaj is talking about, so that further questions are raised and then we have answers for them somewhere in our mind. Thank you.